Every family has that one special place where memories are built, stone by stone. For me, it was our villa at Lake Chelan, a sanctuary my late husband, Robert, and I designed together. So when my only daughter, Emily, informed me that I was no longer welcome, that my home now belonged to her husband's family, it was more than just losing a house. It was an erasure of my entire life with her father. They looked at me and saw a frail, 70-year-old woman they could simply push aside. They didn't realize they were pushing an old architect to do what she does best: plan a meticulous, unforgettable demolition before building something new. If they've ever acted like you weren't there until your absence echoed louder than presence, share your story. And if this feels like your table too, like and subscribe. My name is Helen, and for 70 years, I believed in the quiet strength of family and the enduring integrity of things built with love. As a retired architect, I understood foundations better than most, both the concrete ones that anchor a house to the earth and the invisible ones that are meant to anchor a family through time. This pilgrimage, this 2-hour drive from the gray, impersonal towers of Seattle to the sun-drenched shores of Lake Chelan, was more than a simple weekend getaway. It was a necessary act of restoration for a soul worn thin by the city's subtle dismissals. Just yesterday, a young clerk at the bank had spoken to me in that slow, overly loud voice people reserve for the very young or the very old, explaining a simple transaction as if I were a child. It was a small thing, a paper cut of condescension, but it was one of many that left me feeling like a ghost in my own life. The city's noise and frantic energy slowly peeled away with every mile, replaced by the deep, calming green of the Cascade foothills. I drove with the windows down, letting the scent of pine and distant water wash over me, a perfume of peace that never failed to quiet the static in my soul. Each curve of the highway was familiar, a well-read line in a favorite book, each bend holding a memory of Robert. I remembered him navigating these same roads in his old pickup truck 30 years ago, his face alight with an almost boyish excitement. He had the vision of a businessman, the ability to see potential where others saw only wilderness. "Trust me, Helen," he'd said, pulling over at a scenic overlook. "People will want a piece of this heaven, but our piece will be the best." He was right, of course. He usually was when it came to matters of foresight. But while he saw the investment, I saw the life. I remembered standing on the untouched plot of land, my sketchbook in hand, the breeze from the lake whipping strands of hair across my face. Robert had wrapped his arms around me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder. "What do you see, my brilliant architect?" he'd whispered. I saw a great room with a wall of glass to capture the morning light, a stone fireplace big enough to warm a whole family on a winter's night, and a sprawling terrace where we would grow old together, watching the seasons change on the water. It wasn't just a design, it was a prophecy of the life we intended to live. As I turned onto the private gravel road leading to the property, a sense of homecoming settled over me like a warm blanket. The crunch of the tires on the familiar stones was a welcome sound. The house appeared through the trees exactly as I had designed it, a structure of warm cedar and cool river stone that seemed to grow organically from the hillside. Robert had argued with me about that stone. "It's a nightmare for the budget, honey." He'd chuckled. But I had held firm, insisting that the house needed to be made of the very earth it stood upon. He had relented, and later admitted it was the home's most beautiful feature. Every detail was a conversation, a compromise, a shared decision. It was more than wood and glass. It was a vessel for our shared memories, an archive of our laughter. This was my sanctuary, the place I came to feel close to Robert, to hear the echo of his voice in the rustle of the aspen leaves. But as I pulled my car to a stop, the quiet harmony I anticipated was jarringly absent. The air felt still, but not peaceful. It was tense. A sleek, unfamiliar sedan was parked near the garage, its metallic gray clashing with the natural tones of the landscape. It was a sterile, corporate-looking car, the kind that spoke of ambition and efficiency, and it felt deeply out of place here. It was Mark's car, my son in law. A faint prickle of unease disturbed my calm, sharp and unwelcome. Emily hadn't mentioned they would be here for the weekend. I walked towards the house, my weekend bag feeling suddenly heavier, its contents a good book, a comfortable sweater, a bottle of wine seeming frivolous now. I noticed the large terracotta pot by the entrance, which always held vibrant red geraniums, was empty, a circle of dry, neglected soil. It was a small thing, but it was wrong. And then I saw them. On the expansive terrace, the very heart of our home, stood my daughter, Emily, and her husband, Mark. They weren't just visiting, they were inhabiting the space with a casual ownership that sent a chill down my spine, a cold premonition that stole the warmth of the afternoon sun. They were wearing our bathrobes, not similar ones, but the thick white robes Robert and I had bought on our anniversary trip to Italy, mine with the delicate silver trim. His a simple, stately white. His was hanging loosely on Mark's frame, an impostor in the patriarch's clothes. Emily leaned against the railing, a steaming mug cradled in her hands, her posture languid and proprietary. They were looking out at the lake, my lake, from my terrace, wrapped in my memories. And it felt like watching strangers act out a scene from my own life. When Mark finally turned and saw me standing there, his face flickered with a brief, uncomfortable surprise before settling into a neutral mask. He nudged Emily, who turned slowly, her movements unhurried, almost defiant. The expression on her face was not one of welcome. It was cold, flat, and utterly unreadable. A carefully shuttered window to a room I was no longer invited to enter. I felt my smile falter. The cheerful surprise I had been about to call out dying in my throat. I was the surprise, and it seemed, and an unwelcome one at that. I put my bag down on the stone path, my fingers feeling numb. The scene before me was so profoundly wrong. It was like a painting hung crooked on a wall, a detail so askew it threw the entire room off balance. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Perhaps they had planned a surprise for me, an early birthday celebration. But their faces held no joy, no anticipation. This was my home, every inch of it infused with my love and my grief. And I was being made to feel like an intruder. Emily placed her mug down on the railing with a soft click, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Mom," she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. There was no surprise, no delight, just a stark, unnerving flatness that cut through the air. "You can't stay here this weekend." The words hung in the clean mountain air, sharp and clear and utterly devastating. I blinked, certain I had misheard, that the long drive had muddled my senses. My mind flashed with a desperate, silent plea. "But darling, I just wanted to sit on the terrace. I won't be any trouble. I'll stay in the guest room." But the words never left my thoughts, because the look in her eyes told me they would be useless. Pleading would only underscore my powerlessness. I finally found my voice, though it sounded weak and questioning even to my own ears. "Emily, this is my house." It wasn't an accusation. It was a desperate statement of fact, a plea for reality to reassert itself. She didn't flinch. "I know," she said, as if that were a minor, irrelevant detail. "But Mark and I need some privacy. We're having a romantic weekend." Her gaze was direct, unwavering, and held a crystalline coldness I had never seen. Not even during her most difficult teenage years. This wasn't the daughter I had raised, the girl who had clung to my hand at her father's funeral, her small body racked with sobs. This was a stranger wearing her face, a stranger to whom I was now an inconvenience. I stood rooted to the spot, my heart hammering against my ribs. In that moment, I was no longer a mother arriving at her sanctuary. I was an obstacle, an agenda item to be dealt with. The years of my life, the memories, the very foundation of my ownership, all of it was being waved away for a romantic weekend. I looked past her, at the familiar wooden door that I had sketched and resketched until it was perfect, and I felt a profound sense of dislocation, of being erased from my own story. My breath hitched, a silent sob of disbelief. The memory of Robert's voice came to me then, a whisper from a quieter, safer time. It was from one of the last good afternoons, when we sat on this very terrace and he held my hand, his grip frail but firm. He had been watching Emily through the window as she argued on the phone with a friend, her face a thundercloud of youthful drama. "Be patient with her, Helen," he had said, his eyes filled with a father's endless love. "Losing me will be hard on her. She will need you to be her rock. Just be patient." For 3 years, I had honored that promise as a sacred vow. I had absorbed her moods, forgiven her thoughtlessness, and excused her growing distance, all under the umbrella of her grief. I had been her rock, steady and unyielding, weathering the storm of her sorrow. But as I stood there, watching my daughter claim my home with such casual cruelty, I knew this was no longer about grief. Grief is a storm, but it eventually passes, leaving the sky clearer. This was something else. This was a cold, deliberate fog, rolling in to obscure everything we once were to each other. The patience Robert had asked of me was for a daughter in pain, not for a woman whose eyes held the hard glint of entitlement. 3 years of patience had been given. It had been more than enough. The excuse had expired. "Fine," I heard myself say, the word a dry rasp, tasting like ash in my mouth. I bent down and picked up my bag, my knees creaking in protest. 70 years of life, of building, of loving, and I was being dismissed from my own home like a trespasser. I turned without another word and walked back towards my car. Each step on the gravel path was a retreat, a surrender from a battle I hadn't even known I was supposed to be fighting. Behind me, I heard Emily's voice, softer now, already turning back to Mark to discuss their plans. My presence and my dismissal were already forgotten. The engine of my car started with a quiet, reliable hum, a small pocket of order in a world that had just been thrown into chaos. As I backed out of the driveway, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had seen everything I needed to see in my daughter's eyes. The drive back to Seattle was a blur of muted colors and silent anguish. The majestic landscape that had soothed me just hours before now seemed to mock my pain. The silence in the car was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating shroud of betrayal. In my mind, I began connecting the dots of the past 3 years. The phone calls that were always about a problem she needed solved. The loans that were never mentioned again. The way family had slowly been redefined in her vocabulary to mean only her and Mark. This wasn't a sudden break. It was a quiet, methodical demolition of our relationship that I had been too blind with my own grief to see. The drive back to Seattle was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every landmark that had sparked a warm memory on the way to the lake now stood as a cold monument to my new reality. The silence in the car was no longer a peaceful companion, but a heavy, suffocating shroud woven from my daughter's dismissal. Back in my apartment, with the familiar skyline of the city glittering impersonally outside my window, that silence followed me. It filled the corners of every room, a constant, humming reminder of the void that had just been carved into the heart of my family. The following days were a study in suspended animation. I moved through my routines on autopilot, brewing coffee I barely tasted, reading pages of books whose words I couldn't absorb. My life, once so rich with purpose and connection, had been reduced to waiting. I was waiting for the phone to ring, caught in a torturous limbo between dread and a desperate, foolish hope. A part of me, the mother who had held her in my arms, prayed that Emily would call to apologize, to explain that it was all a terrible misunderstanding, that her words had been born of stress, not malice. But another, newer part of me, a part forged in the cold shock on that terrace, knew better. It knew that the call, if it came, would not be one of reconciliation. Still, Every time the phone chirped with a notification or rang with an unfamiliar number, my heart would leap into my throat, a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. The world felt muffled, distant, as if I were listening to it from underwater, my own home, a place usually filled with the comforting presence of Robert's books and my architectural drafts, felt like a stranger's apartment. The call came on Monday evening. I was in my study, a room that served as a museum to my former life, surrounded by framed blueprints of buildings I had designed and photographs of Robert and me at various groundbreaking ceremonies. A half-empty cup of long cold coffee sat at my elbow. The name Emily flashed on the screen, and for a heartbeat, the foolish, hopeful part of me won. I answered, my voice softer than I intended. Emily, darling. Hi, Mom, she began, her tone bright and breezy, utterly disconnected from the cold dismissal of our last encounter. It was the voice she used when she was about to ask for something, a carefully constructed melody of casual affection. How have you been? I hope you weren't too upset about the other day. Things were just a little chaotic. My breath caught. An apology. An explanation. The hope surged, blinding me for a moment. I was worried, I said, my own voice betraying a pathetic tremble of relief. I'm glad you called. Of course, she chirped. Listen, the reason I'm calling is that Mark and I have been doing a lot of thinking, and we've come up with the most wonderful solution for Gary and Susan. I listened, my hand tightening on the receiver, the brief warmth of hope already beginning to cool and harden into dread. She spoke of her in-laws, the Wilsons, painting a dramatic picture of their financial struggles, a lost pension, rising rent, the constant worry. She made them sound like victims of a cruel world, deserving of a great rescue. And then she delivered the thesis of her argument, her voice smooth and reasonable, as if she were proposing the most logical idea in the world. The villa, she said simply. A profound silence fell, in which I could hear the faint hum of the city traffic 10 floors below. It's the perfect answer. Mom, it's just sitting there most of the year. It's far too big for one person to manage anyway. We've talked it over with them, and they are so incredibly grateful for the opportunity. My mind struggled to process the sheer audacity. She spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if my role was simply to rubber stamp their benevolent plan. She was not asking. She was informing me of a conclusion they had reached about my property, my home, my life's work. What opportunity? Emily, I asked, my voice a low whisper. The opportunity to make it their home. Of course, she said, a hint of impatience creeping into her tone, as if I were being deliberately obtuse. They could move in by the end of the month. It would solve all their problems. And it would give you peace of mind, knowing that the house is being used and loved by family. Family, and she used that word. And it felt like a deliberate twist of the knife. The Wilsons were Mark's family. To me, they were polite strangers I saw at holidays, people with whom I had absolutely no shared history, no emotional connection. The idea of them living in the house that Robert and I had built, sleeping in our room, using our things, it was a violation so profound I felt a wave of nausea. My memories of the villa flashed through my mind, Robert and I, covered in sawdust, laughing as we installed the kitchen cabinets ourselves, the day we planted the birch trees by the driveway, envisioning them growing old with us, the quiet nights spent reading by the fire, his feet resting on my lap. These weren't just memories. They were the very soul of the place. And Emily was proposing to liquidate that soul for the convenience of strangers. Emily, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. That villa is not just a house. Your father and I built it. It's everything. Her laugh was short and sharp, devoid of any humor. Oh, Mom, don't be so dramatic. It's a building, a very nice building, but you're being sentimental. And frankly, a little selfish. The word hit me like a physical blow. Selfish. Me, who had paid for her wedding, cleared her college loans, and provided the down payment for the apartment she now shared with Mark. I had given her everything she had ever asked for, believing it was what a loving mother did. Besides, she continued, her voice hardening into a blade of pure pragmatism, you're old now and you're alone. What could you possibly need with such a big place? It's a burden. We're trying to help you. And help them? It's the most logical thing to do. Old and alone. The words echoed in the silent study, stripping away my identity as an architect, a wife, a matriarch, and leaving me with a label of pathetic uselessness. They saw me as a relic, a remnant of a past life whose assets could now be appraised and redistributed for the convenience of the living. It was in that moment that something inside me, something that had been dormant for 3 long years, began to stir. It was the memory of Robert's voice, but it wasn't the memory of him asking for patience. It was a different memory, a different conversation entirely. It was from years ago. I had co-signed a loan for a cousin who had subsequently defaulted, leaving me with the bill. I had been lamenting my own soft-heartedness, and Robert had taken my hand, his expression serious. Helen, he had said, kindness without boundaries isn't a virtue. It's an invitation for disrespect. You build magnificent houses with unbreachable foundations. You need to apply the same principles to your life. Your kindness is a treasure, not a public utility. His words, which had been a gentle rebuke then, now returned as a blinding revelation. A blueprint snapping into place in my mind. The fog of grief, the veil of maternal obligation, the self-imposed mandate of patience, it all burned away in an instant of terrible clarity. I saw the last 3 years not as a period of my daughter's grief, but as a calculated campaign of escalating appropriation. I had been her rock. But a rock is not meant to be endlessly chipped away until it is nothing but gravel. My kindness had been treated as a utility, and now the service was being disconnected. The trembling in my hand stopped. The frantic bird in my chest grew still. A cold, quiet strength, unfamiliar and yet deeply my own, flooded through me. It was the architect, the planner, the woman who understood foundations, and she was finally awake. No, I said. The word was quiet, almost conversational, yet it felt as if I had shouted it from a mountaintop. It landed in the space between us with the weight of granite. On the other end of the line, there was a stunned silence. I could almost hear Emily's mind working, trying to compute a response she had never before needed. What did you just say? She stammered, her breezy confidence gone. I said no, Emily, I repeated, and my voice was steady, calm, and as solid as the foundation of the house she was trying to steal. The answer is no. You can't say no to me, she sputtered, her composure finally cracking to reveal the raw entitlement beneath. That house is wasted on you. Gary and Susan need it. This is about family. No, I said again, the word a shield. This is about respect, something you seem to have forgotten entirely. Dad would be ashamed of you. He would never have been this selfish, she shrieked, playing her last, most desperate card, but it was a miscalculation. Invoking Robert's memory no longer weakened me. It strengthened me. I knew exactly what the man who had warned me about kindness without boundaries would think. Your father, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, would be horrified by what you've become. A sharp intake of breath on her end. And then, for the first time in my 70 years, for the first time since she was a child who had scraped her knee and needed my comfort, I hung up on my daughter. The click of the phone settling into its cradle was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a door being closed, a foundation being secured, and a war being declared. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with purpose. The silence that followed the disconnected call was not empty. It was a vessel, and I filled it with a lifetime of architectural discipline. Grief had made me passive, a spectator in my own life, but Emily's cruelty had inadvertently handed me back my own blueprints. I did not sleep. I sat in the leather chair in my study, the same chair where Robert used to read his financial papers, and I watched the darkness outside my Seattle apartment bleed into the gray of dawn. I retrieved the original schematics for the villa from my flat file drawer, the heavy paper cool and smooth beneath my fingertips, unrolling them across my desk. I traced the lines I had drawn 3 decades ago, my mind recalling every decision, every challenge, the load-bearing walls, the flow of movement between spaces, the precise angle of the windows to capture the morning sun. It was all there, a language I hadn't spoken fluently in years, but had never forgotten. This house was my creation. It had a grammar, a logic, and then zaba, and I would not allow it to be desecrated. Before the sun had fully risen, I was at Robert's old filing cabinet, a handsome oak piece he had cherished. My fingers, steady now, moved past the files for household warranties and old tax returns, landing on a folder labeled Legal and Estate. Inside, among the carefully organized documents, was a crisp business card for Michael Davis, the junior partner Robert had taken a liking to years ago, calling him a sharp kid with an old soul. Robert had built our fortune on trusting the right people, on building relationships as sturdy as the foundations of his commercial properties. I would honor his legacy by doing the same. I did not need to search for options. I needed to execute a decision that had crystallized in the pre-dawn quiet, as clear and sharp as the lines on my blueprints. The offices of Davis and Associates were on the 42nd floor of a downtown skyscraper, with a panoramic view of Puget Sound that was both breathtaking and imposing. Michael Davis was no longer a kid. He was a man in his late 40s with kind eyes and the reassuring calm of a seasoned professional. He greeted me with a warm handshake and a genuine sadness in his eyes as he mentioned Robert. "He was a great man, Mrs. Hayes," Michael said, guiding me to a chair. "One of a kind. I learned more from him in a few lunches than in a whole semester of law school. How can I help you?" His office was a place of quiet power, the scent of old books and brewing coffee a comforting anchor in my sea of turmoil. I did not waste time with pleasantries or recount the sordid details of my daughter's betrayal. A good architect never blames the storm. She reinforces the foundations. "Michael," I began, my voice even and clear, "I need to restructure my estate. Specifically, the property at Lake Chelan." He listened patiently, his pen poised over a legal pad. As he outlined the standard options gifting, selling, various forms of trusts, he was being thorough, a good lawyer doing his job. "A revocable trust would give you flexibility," he suggested gently. "And have you considered speaking with Emily about your intentions? Family matters can often be resolved through communication." I held up a hand, not unkindly, but with a firmness that stopped him mid-sentence. "Michael, my daughter's recent actions have made communication impossible and flexibility a liability. I am not here to explore options. I am here to give you an instruction." I leaned forward, my hands clasped on his polished mahogany desk. "I want to create an irrevocable trust, the most ironclad version possible. I want it named the Robert Hayes Foundation, and I want the Lake Chelan property to be its sole initial asset." I explained my vision: a foundation that would provide grants for affordable housing projects, a way to turn the home that was being stolen out of greed into a source of shelter for those in genuine need. It was the perfect tribute to Robert, a man who built things for a living. Michael's professional calm wavered, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "An irrevocable trust is a very permanent step. Helen, it would mean you no longer own the property. It would belong entirely to the foundation." I met his gaze without blinking. "I understand that completely, but I would like to retain lifetime usage rights, if possible, but ownership must be transferred. Fully and permanently. I want the process to begin today." The look of surprise on his face slowly transformed into one of deep respect. He saw not a grieving, emotional widow, but a woman making a calculated, strategic move. He nodded slowly, setting his pen down. "Of course. Helen, we can begin drafting the documents immediately. Robert would have been proud of your clarity." Leaving the lawyer's office, I felt a weight lift, not of sadness, but of indecision. The first part of the new foundation was being laid, but it was a slow process, a fortress being built brick by legal brick. What Emily had done felt immediate, a home invasion of the soul, and it required a more immediate response. In the cab on the way home, I made another call. My fingers dialed the number for George, the groundskeeper at the villa for over 20 years, a man whose loyalty was as deeply rooted as the old growth pines on the property. George, it's Helen Hayes, I said. His voice was like the gravel on the villa's driveway, weathered and familiar. Mrs. Hayes? It's good to hear from you. I was, well, I'm glad you called. The hesitation in his voice confirmed my fears. George, has my daughter been to the house recently? A heavy sigh came through the phone. Yes, ma'am, last Tuesday. She was there with her husband and his parents. I didn't want to overstep or trouble you, but it wasn't like a normal visit. I held my breath. What was it like, George? They were measuring things. Mrs. Hayes, he said, his voice low with disapproval. The older woman, Mrs. Wilson, she had a tape measure. She was pointing at the great room, talking about where her sofa would go and how the light wasn't good for her ferns. The younger man, Mark, he kicked at the base of the terrace wall and said something about better flow. The older gentleman, Mr. Wilson, he even asked me if the septic tank had been serviced recently. They were acting like they were minutes away from moving in. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. I closed my eyes, the image searing itself into my mind. The casual, vulture-like way they were picking apart the home I had designed, the life I had built. You did the right thing by telling me, George, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Thank you. That evening, as I stood in my own apartment, the confirmation from George burned within me like a cold fire. The legal strategy was sound, but it was a silent, distant defense. I needed something more. I needed them to understand, not just legally, but viscerally, what it felt like to have a home, a sanctuary, turned against you. As I stared out the window, I saw my neighbor, Ben, a young man who worked for some cybersecurity firm, tinkering with a drone in the building's communal garden. Wires and circuit boards were spread out on a picnic table around him. I had watched him before, admiring his intense focus, the way he, too, was a builder, just in a different medium. An idea, wild and unconventional, began to form in my mind a design problem that required a very different kind of architecture. I approached him the next day. Ben, I said, my voice calm and direct. I have a design project I'd like to discuss with you. It's a rather unusual one, a short-term, site-specific installation. The theme is psychological displacement. The young man, who usually had his face buried in a screen, looked up, his interest piqued by the unusual terminology. He saw me not as a lonely old woman asking for help with her Wi-Fi, but as a professional with a challenge. You have my attention. Helen, he said, a curious glint in his eye. In his apartment, surrounded by the organized chaos of high-end technology, I laid out the situation, not with emotional appeals, but with the dispassionate clarity of a client briefing a contractor. I even brought a copy of the villa's floor plan. I spoke of a property with unwelcome guests and the need to create an environment that would strongly encourage them to leave, permanently. His eyes lit up with a creator's enthusiasm. Tell me about the tech at the villa, he said, leaning forward while my husband, Robert, I explained, was a futurist. He had a top-of-the-line, a fully integrated smart home system installed years ago. He called it the legacy system. Everything is connected lights, water, sound, security. A wide grin spread across Ben's face. Oh, this is perfect, he said, almost purring. A legacy system like that is a closed loop, but with the right access. You don't have to build a new system. You just have to teach the old one new tricks. Our collaboration began right there. He started whiteboarding, sketching out the system's logic flow. He talked about APIs, triggers, and cascading event scripts. I translated it into the language I knew best. So, I pointed to the blueprint. If a motion sensor is triggered in the foyer zone 1 that could initiate a randomized lighting sequence in the great room zone 2 like a ripple effect, he nodded eagerly. My architect's mind, the part of me that understood how light, shadow, and sound could manipulate human emotion and perception, came alive. We don't want it to be obvious, I explained. We use sound to create unease, a whisper from an empty corner, the sound of footsteps on the floor above. We use light to make familiar spaces feel threatening, a slow, pulsing strobe that changes the color of the walls. We can alter their perception of the very space they are trying to claim, make the hallways seem longer, the rooms feel colder. I was no longer just a grieving widow. I was a designer again, and this was my most personal project yet. Ben, the tech wizard, would build the engine, but I, the architect, would design the experience. But man, we were not planning a prank. We were designing a psychological fortress, and its walls were closing in. The drive back to Lake Chelan was a stark contrast to my previous solitary journeys. This time, I was not a pilgrim seeking solace, but a general returning to the battlefield, and I was not alone. Ben sat in the passenger seat, his laptop open, studying the schematics of the legacy system that I had provided. The mood in the car was not somber. It was electric with a focused, creative energy. He saw a complex technical puzzle, a mountain of code to be conquered. I saw a canvas, a three-dimensional space waiting to be imbued with a new, unsettling narrative. We were a strange alliance, a 70-year-old architect and a 20-something cybersecurity expert united by a shared appreciation for elegant design and a mutual disdain for bullies. Entering the villa felt different this time. The familiar sense of warmth and memory was still there, but it was overlaid with a new, clinical purpose. I saw the house not as a sanctuary of the past, but as an instrument of the future. Every hallway was a potential sightline, every room a stage, every shadow a potential accomplice. The main control panel is in the basement utility room. I told Ben, leading him down the stairs. Robert believed in centralized nervous systems, for both his businesses and his home. Ben's eyes lit up as he saw the clean, organized panel, a testament to my husband's meticulous nature. "This is beautiful," he murmured. More a statement of professional admiration than aesthetic praise. "Your husband didn't cut any corners. This makes my job much easier." For 2 days, the villa became our workshop. Ben plugged his formidable laptop into the system's core, and the quiet house filled with the soft, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. Lines of code scrolled across his screen as he delved into the digital heart of the house, mapping its pathways and unlocking its capabilities. My role was that of the director. I walked through each space, floor plan in hand, dictating the psychological effect I wanted to achieve. An entryway is a building's first handshake. "Ben," I explained, standing by the front door. "It sets the tone. Normally, it should say, 'Welcome.' We need to reprogram this handshake to say, 'Beware.' The dimming lights are the first sign of a weak grip, a sign that the house itself is unwell." "Got it," he replied without looking up from his screen. "We can also add a low-frequency hum, just below the conscious hearing range. They won't know they're hearing it, but their subconscious will. It creates a baseline of anxiety." I smiled. He understood completely. We moved to the great room, with its grand fireplace and wall of windows overlooking the lake. "Here, the effect needs to be more dramatic. After 30 seconds of continued presence, I want a cascade. A single light directly above them flickers and dies. Then another. Then the audio. A whisper. Not a scream, just a single, clear whisper that seems to come from the darkest corner of the room. It should sound like it's right behind them, While he worked on the software, I focused on the hardware. We installed tiny, high-definition cameras, no larger than a screw head, into the carved rosettes of the ceiling trim and the dark recesses of bookshelves. We placed compact, professional-grade speakers behind air vents and under furniture, creating a web of sound that could emanate from anywhere, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. I found one of Robert's old work pencils, worn down to a stub, tucked inside a book on structural engineering. Holding it, I felt a fresh wave of resolve. He built things to last. He built things with integrity. I would not let his legacy be dismantled by greed. The most critical installation was the backup power system. In the main utility closet, Ben installed a series of heavy, industrial-grade batteries, wiring them into the system with a seamless transfer switch. If they find the main breaker and shut it off, he explained, wiping sweat from his brow, the house won't even flicker. The lights, the sounds, the cameras, everything will continue the performance, uninterrupted. That's when the real panic will set in when they realize they have no control at all. On the evening of the second day, we were ready for a full test. I stood in the center of the living room, the heart of the house, while Ben stood on the terrace with his tablet, which now served as our command center. Ready. Helen, he asked. I took a deep breath, the scent of cedar and stone filling my lungs. Proceed. He tapped the screen. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the light directly above me began to pulse, a slow, sickening rhythm like a dying heartbeat. From the hallway, I heard the distinct sound of a heavy footstep on the hardwood floor, followed by silence. The air grew perceptibly colder. A voice, a digitally altered whisper that was neither male nor female, slithered from a speaker behind the sofa. You are not welcome here. You are not welcome. A genuine shiver traced its way down my spine. It was working even better than I had imagined. The familiar, beloved space of my living room had been transformed into something alien and menacing. The play of light and shadow made the furniture seem to distend and warp, and the silence between the sounds was more terrifying than the sounds themselves. Shut it down! I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. The lights returned to normal. The silence became peaceful again. Ben came inside, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. As an architect, Helen, you designed a beautiful home, he said. As a collaborator, you've designed a truly terrifying experience. That night, we ate sandwiches on the terrace in the cool evening air, the house now a silent, sleeping beast behind us, waiting for its cue. The next morning, Sunday, we did one final sweep. Every tool was packed, every wire hidden, every surface wiped clean. The villa stood serene and beautiful in the morning light, betraying none of the technological malevolence that now lurked just beneath its skin. The last thing I did was place the sign on the front door myself. It was printed on a thick, professional-looking PVC board with clean, authoritative lettering. It read, Warning Legacy. Smart home system, undergoing unscheduled level 3 diagnostics. Entry is not advised. Enter at your own risk. It was their final warning, their one chance to turn back. An off-ramp from the consequences they had set in motion. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that they would not take it. Ben and I drove away, leaving the house to its silent vigil. I didn't return to Seattle. Instead, I checked into a small, secluded lakefront cabin a few miles down the shore, a place with a strong internet connection and a view of the same water my villa overlooked. It would be my command post. In the quiet solitude of the cabin, I opened my laptop and connected to the secure feed Ben had set up. 3 camera angles of the villa's exterior appeared on my screen in crisp, high definition. The driveway, the front entrance, the terrace. I watched the peaceful scene for hours, the birds flitting between the pines, the sunlight sparkling on the distant lake. I was calm, I was an architect reviewing a site before the start of demolition. At exactly 2:28 p.m., a dark blue minivan appeared on the camera, monitoring the main road, right on schedule. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The van pulled into the driveway with a casual confidence, as if its occupants had done so 100 times before. The doors slid open, and my daughter, Emily, emerged first, stretching languidly in the sun. She surveyed the villa not with the awe of a visitor, but with the smug satisfaction of a conqueror. Mark climbed out from the driver's side, followed by his parents, Gary and Susan Wilson. They moved with the eager anticipation of people about to receive a great prize they had not earned. They were not visiting. They were arriving for a coronation. They gathered at the back of the van, unloading suitcases and boxes. It was not a weekend trip. It was a relocation. Susan Wilson clutched a purse in one hand and a pair of house slippers in the other, ready to make herself comfortable in my home. She looked at the house with a possessive, appraising glare, her eyes scanning the roofline and windows as if she were calculating its resale value. They approached the front door as a unified group, four people radiating an unshakable certainty in their right to be there. Then they saw the sign. They stopped. I watched Susan's face darken as she read it. Her voice, tinny but clear through the hidden microphone, crackled with indignation. "What is this nonsense? Is your mother trying to be funny?" "Emily?" Emily laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Oh, that's just mom being eccentric and dramatic. She probably thinks it's some kind of joke. She's harmless. Don't worry about it." Mark shrugged. "The old woman's always been a little strange. Let's just get inside." But Susan Wilson was not finished. Her face was flushed with a righteous anger, as if the sign were a personal insult to her new status. She grabbed the corner of the professionally mounted placard and yanked it from the wall with surprising strength. The sound of the plastic cracking and the screws tearing from the wood was sharp and decisive. The sign clattered to the stone steps. "There," Susan declared, kicking the fallen sign aside with her foot as if it were a piece of trash. "I will not have some silly, threatening note ruining our first day in our new home." "Good for you." "Mom," Mark said with an approving nod. Emily beamed. "You're absolutely right. Susan, this is your house now." Through the cold, impartial lens of the camera, I watched them step over the broken pieces of my final warning. They had not just ignored the boundary, they had destroyed it with contempt. So be it, I thought, my gaze fixed on the screen. "You have chosen." Mark slid a key into the lock, a key I had entrusted to my daughter years ago, and the door swung open. Emily ushered her in-laws across the threshold of my home, her voice echoing through the entryway. "Make yourselves completely at home," she announced with a grand, welcoming gesture. "This place is all yours now." I watched them disappear inside. On my laptop screen, a small, discreet icon blinked green. All systems were armed. The stage was set. The audience was in their seats. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the tea I had brewed. I looked out my own cabin window at the peaceful, indifferent lake. I took one last deep breath, not of hesitation, but of finality. My finger moved to the trackpad, the cursor hovering over the master control icon on my screen, an icon simply labeled Begin. My finger hovered over the icon, a simple, elegant word, Begin. It felt inadequate for the complex sequence of events it was about to unleash. For a few moments, I let them settle in. I watched through the discrete camera feeds as they explored my home, their voices echoing with a jarring sense of ownership. Susan Wilson ran her hand over my marble kitchen countertops, murmuring something to her husband about how much more practical her own butcher block island was. Gary made himself comfortable in Robert's favorite leather armchair, putting his feet up on the ottoman without a second thought. In the master bedroom, my bedroom, Robert's and my room, I watched Emily and Mark discuss their plans. "We'll knock out this wall," Mark said. gesturing towards the small sitting area. Create a much larger ensuite, and these dark wood floors have to go. Something lighter, more modern. Emily nodded in enthusiastic agreement. They were not just moving in, they were erasing us. Every word they spoke was another justification for what I was about to do. I waited until the house grew quiet, until the camera feeds showed darkened rooms and the stillness of sleep. I waited until they were at their most vulnerable, dreaming their triumphant dreams in my bed. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I clicked the icon. The performance did not begin with a crash, but with a whisper. In the master bedroom, the temperature subtly dropped by 5 degrees. A faint, almost inaudible hum began to emanate from the walls, a low-frequency thrum designed to unsettle the subconscious. In their sleep, Mark stirred, pulling the covers tighter. In the guest room, a single floorboard in the hallway outside the Wilsons' door creaked. A sound programmed by Ben to mimic the weight of a person standing just outside. These were the opening notes. The quiet calibration of fear. I watched their sleeping forms on the monitors, the architect in me appreciating the silent, structural beginning of the experience I had designed. Phase 2 began 10 minutes later, in the Wilsons' room. The large television on the wall flickered on, not to a channel, but to a screen of pure, hissing static. The sound was soft at first, but slowly grew in volume. Susan stirred, muttering in her sleep. In my bedroom, the ensuite bathroom faucet turned on, a thin, steady stream of water splashing into the porcelain sink. An insistent, maddening sound in the dead of night. Emily rolled over, pulling a pillow over her head. They were being gently prodded from their slumber, their minds still trying to categorize the sounds as normal, as explainable. This was the critical part of the design to make the house itself seem as if it were slowly going insane. Then, I initiated phase 3. All at once, the house came alive. In the Wilsons' room, the lights began to strobe, not with a frantic rhythm, but with a slow, nauseating pulse of deep, unsettling blue. The static on the television was replaced by the sound of a music box playing a children's lullaby, but a warped, distorted version where the notes were slightly off-key. Susan Wilson sat bolt upright in bed, her scream muffled by the oppressive sound. Gary fumbled for the lamp on his nightstand, but the switch did nothing. The house was no longer obeying their commands. Simultaneously, in the master bedroom, the lights flashed a brilliant, searing red, and every faucet, the sink, the shower, the large soaking tub erupted at full blast, the sound a deafening roar of rushing water. The chaos was magnificent in its coordination. They stumbled out of their respective rooms, their faces masks of terror and confusion in the pulsing, colored lights. "What in God's name is happening?" Gary yelled over the noise. They met in the grand hallway, the heart of the home, where the true performance was beginning. The hidden speakers began their symphony. A young girl's weeping seemed to come from the top of the stairs. The sound of heavy, dragging footsteps echoed from the empty dining room. And then, the projections Ben had so cleverly installed began to flicker to life. On the far wall of the hallway, a tall, slender shadow of a man seemed to pace back and forth, a dark silhouette against the strobing lights. "It's the wiring! It must be a power surge!" Susan shrieked, her hands over her ears. But Mark, his face pale but his eyes sharp with anger, grabbed Emily's arm. "This is not a power surge. This is deliberate. It's your damn mother. She's doing this somehow." Emily, her arrogance warring with her terror, shook her head frantically. "Don't be ridiculous. My mother can't even program her television remote. This is something else. The house is old. It's falling apart." Her complete and total underestimation of me, even in the midst of this technological hell, was her fatal flaw. She would rather believe in ghosts than in her mother's competence. From my quiet cabin across the lake, I watched the 4 of them on my laptop screen, their panicked movements displayed in a grid of 4 camera feeds. They were mice in a maze of my own design, and in every path they chose led to more confusion. Mark tried the light switches, flipping them up and down with useless, angry clicks. Gary ran to the front door, yanking on the handle, only to find it locked solid by the smart system. Susan collapsed into a sobbing heap on the floor, pointing a trembling finger at a wall where a projected shadow seemed to wave at her. My face was calm, impassive. I took a slow sip of my tea as the sound of Susan's terrified scream echoed from my laptop speakers. The house was rejecting them, and I was its architect. The night was long. The systems were programmed to operate in waves, a relentless cycle of chaos and unnerving silence. For 20 minutes, the house would assail them with its full arsenal of light and sound. Then, abruptly, everything would stop. The lights would return to a dim, normal glow. The water would cease. The silence would return, thick and heavy with dread. In these quiet moments, I would watch them. They would whisper frantically to each other, trying to make sense of what was happening. And just as a fragile sense of calm began to settle, a new sequence would begin, this time with different sounds, different lighting patterns, keeping them constantly off balance, never allowing them to adapt. By 4 a.m., they had been thoroughly broken. They were huddled together in the great room, wrapped in blankets, flinching at every shadow, every creak of the old house. They had tried to find the main breaker panel in the basement, but even if they had succeeded, Ben's backup batteries would have rendered their efforts futile. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, a psychological cage built from their greed. As the first hint of dawn began to streak the sky a soft, forgiving gray, I initiated the final sequence, a gradual, peaceful shutdown. The sounds faded, the lights settled into a warm, welcoming glow, and with a soft, audible click, the front door unlocked. The performance was over. Their escape was a frantic, disorganized rout. They didn't bother with their suitcases or the boxes they had so confidently carried in. They stumbled out of the front door like survivors fleeing a natural disaster, their faces pale and etched with the sleepless horror of the night. They scrambled into their minivan and sped down the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. They were gone. The house was quiet again. It was mine. My phone rang at exactly 7:30 a.m. I had been waiting for the call. I let it ring 3 times before answering, composing my voice into a mask of gentle, sleepy concern. "Hello, Mom." Emily's voice was a ragged shriek, a raw nerve of hysteria and exhaustion. "What did you do? What did you do to that house?" I feigned a groggy confusion. "Emily, sweetheart, what are you talking about? It's early. Are you all right? Don't you dare play innocent with me, that you sick, twisted old woman," she screamed, her words tumbling over each other in a torrent of rage and fear. The house went insane. It was possessed. Lights, water, voices screaming at us. Gary and Susan are traumatized. They think the place is haunted. I allowed a long pause, then filled my voice with perfectly calibrated maternal concern. "My goodness, Emily, that sounds absolutely terrifying." Voices, shadows. "Are you sure you weren't all just having a bad dream?" I could almost feel her sputtering on the other end of the line. "Bakasio?" "A dream. 4 people don't have the same 8-hour nightmare simultaneously." "Sweetheart," I said, my tone gentle and soothing. "You all sound incredibly stressed. The first thing you need to do is call the police. Right now, there could have been an intruder, or it could be dangerous faulty wiring. You must have them check it out. Please, call them for my peace of mind." There was a moment of confused silence. This was not the reaction she had expected. I had given her a logical, responsible course of action, one that shifted the focus from me to a tangible, external investigation. "The police," she stammered. "Yes, immediately." I insisted. "I won't be able to rest until I know you are all safe and the house has been secured." I hung up, leaving her with no other rational choice. I turned my attention back to my laptop, reactivating the camera feeds. An hour later, a police cruiser pulled into the driveway. I watched as 2 uniformed officers met a visibly shaken Emily and Mark at the front door. I saw them explain, waving their hands frantically. The officers listened with patient, skeptical expressions, then proceeded inside. My cameras recorded their every move. They conducted a thorough, methodical search. They checked every window and door for signs of forced entry, finding none. They examined the electrical panel, which appeared perfectly normal. They walked through every room, which was now pristine and silent. After 30 minutes, they emerged, their expressions conveying a mixture of boredom and pity. Through the exterior microphone, I heard the lead officer's report. "Ma'am, sir," he said, addressing Emily and Mark, "we've conducted a full search of the premises. There are no signs of a break-in, no tripped alarms, no vandalism. From what you've described, it sounds like this property, which is a very high-end smart home, experienced a series of complex and cascading system malfunctions. A glitch cascade, we sometimes call it. We've seen it before in homes with this level of integrated technology. It's not a criminal matter." He handed Mark a card. "Our official recommendation is for the owner to call a certified technician to run a full diagnostic." A glitch cascade. I thought, a small, cold smile touching my lips for the first time in days. A beautifully bland, technical term for a meticulously designed psychological demolition. He couldn't have chosen a more perfect phrase. Emily stood there, speechless, her mouth slightly agape. Her weapon, her accusation against me, had been neutralized by a calm, rational, official explanation. She had no proof. She had no recourse. She just had a story about a haunted house that made her sound unstable. The officers got back in their car and drove away, leaving Emily and Mark standing alone on the driveway of the home that had so utterly and completely rejected them. I watched them for a long moment. Two small figures dwarfed by the magnificent house they had tried to claim. Then, with a final, satisfying click, I shut down the camera feed. The humiliation was complete. The architect had inspected the demolition, and the site was now clear. The drive back to Seattle was one of quiet purpose. The frantic energy of the past few days had subsided, replaced by the calm, steady focus of an architect reviewing the final stages of a complex project. The demolition phase was complete. Now it was time for the final, unbreachable construction. I did not go home expecting peace. I knew the final confrontation was inevitable. My daughter and her husband were not the types to accept defeat gracefully. They would come, armed with fury and indignation, to make one last, desperate stand. I spent the evening in my study, not preparing a defense, but simply centering myself. I brewed a pot of Earl Grey tea, the familiar aroma a small comfort in the charged silence. I sat in Robert's leather chair, not as a widow seeking his ghost, but as his partner, his equal, ready to protect the legacy we had built together. The knock came at 8 o'clock the next evening. It was not a knock, but a frantic, angry banging that rattled the door in its frame. It was the sound of desperation, of people who had lost control and were trying to reclaim it through brute force. I took a slow, calming sip of my tea before rising. I smoothed the front of my simple silk blouse and walked to the door, my heart beating not with fear, but with a strange, resolute calm. I opened it to find them just as I had pictured, disheveled, wild-eyed, and radiating a toxic aura of rage. Emily's face was pale and blotchy from crying, her hair a mess. Mark stood beside her, his jaw clenched, his expensive suit rumpled, trying to use his height to loom over me in the doorway. He failed. "We need to talk," Emily spat, pushing past me into my entryway without being invited. Mark followed, closing the door behind him with a sharp click that seemed to seal us all in for the final act. I simply turned and walked back toward my living room, gesturing to the sofa. I would not engage them in a shouting match at my front door. This would be handled on my terms, in my space. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Emily began, her voice trembling with fury as she paced back and forth on my Persian rug. "That little haunted house stunt. Did you have fun? Mother terrorizing your own family?" I remained silent, letting her pour out the poison. It was important that she exhaust herself, that she lay all her useless weapons on the table. We'll sue you, Mark chimed in, his voice a low growl. We'll sue you for harassment, for psychological damage, for emotional distress. We will take you for every penny you have left. I watched him, a man I had once welcomed into my family, and felt nothing but a distant pity. He was threatening me with a battle whose outcome I had already decided. On what grounds? Market, I thought. A police report that clears me? An official finding of a technical malfunction. Your lawsuit would be laughed out of court before it was even filed. We will tell everyone, Emily shrieked, her voice climbing with hysteria. We'll tell all of your friends, all of Dad's old business partners. We will ruin your reputation in this city. They will see you for the cruel, vindictive old woman you really are. My reputation, I mused, was built on decades of integrity, of buildings that still stood, of contracts honored. It was a structure of steel and concrete. Her words were nothing more than angry graffiti, easily washed away. Then she delivered the line she believed was her ultimate weapon, her voice dropping with venom. You will never see your grandchildren. When Mark and I have children, they will never know you exist. You will die alone, forgotten. That was the one that landed, not as a wound, but as a moment of profound, clarifying sadness. It was not a threat that frightened me, but a tragedy she was inflicting upon herself and her unborn children. She was so consumed by her greed that she would deny her own children a grandmother, deny them a connection to their own history, all for a house she could not have. In that moment, I saw the full extent of her self-destruction. She had already lost, not because of what I had done, but because of who she had become. When their tirade finally subsided, when they stood panting in the middle of my living room, spent and empty, I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, calm, and carried the weight of finality. Are you finished? They stared at me, momentarily confused by my lack of reaction. If you have said everything you feel you need to say, I continued, rising slowly from my chair. Then I have a proposal. If you want a real resolution, one that is legal and final, meet me at Michael Davis's office tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. We will end this then. I then walked to my front door and opened it. A clear, silent dismissal. Baffled by my control of a situation they had intended to dominate, they stumbled out into the hallway. The final confrontation was not to be a battle of wills in my living room. It would be an unconditional surrender, conducted in a boardroom. The conference room at Davis & Associates was exactly as I remembered it, a place of quiet, serious power. This time, however, it was fully occupied. Emily and Mark sat on one side of the large mahogany table, their faces a mixture of defiance and nervous anticipation. They had dressed for battle, in sharp, professional attire, believing they were coming to a negotiation. On the other side, looking small and bewildered, sat Gary and Susan Wilson. And at the head of the table, I sat with my lawyer, Michael Davis, beside me. He had a single, handsome, leather-bound folder on the table in front of him. Thank you all for coming, Michael began, his voice calm and professional. Emily interrupted him immediately. Let's just cut to the chase, shall we? We are here to discuss the transfer of the Lake Chelan property to my husband's parents. My mother has been difficult, but we are confident we can come to an arrangement. She looked at me, a smug, challenging glint in her eye. I did not meet her gaze. I simply looked at Michael and gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. That was his cue. Actually, Michael said, opening the folder before him, that will not be possible. The ownership of the Lake Chelan property is no longer in question. Emily's confident smile faltered. What does that mean? Mark demanded, leaning forward. Michael looked at him, his expression professionally neutral. It means that as of 2 days ago, Mrs. Hayes no longer owns the villa. Therefore, she cannot transfer its ownership to anyone. The silence in the room was absolute. Emily's face went white. That's impossible, she whispered. It's a lie. I assure you, it is not, Michael continued, turning a page in the folder. The property in question, along with a significant portion of Mrs. Hayes's liquid assets, has been irrevocably transferred to a newly established charitable entity. He paused for effect. The entity is called the Robert Hayes Foundation. The name hit Emily like a physical blow. She recoiled in her chair as if she had been struck. The foundation's mandate, Michael went on, his voice clear and steady, is to provide grants for the development of affordable housing and to support shelters for families in need. The transfer is legal, binding, and permanent. You gave it away, Mark stammered, the financial implications dawning on him, his face turning a pale shade of green. You gave our house away to strangers? I did not give your house away, I said, speaking for the first time, my voice quiet but carrying across the silent room. I gave my house away, a home you tried to steal through manipulation and contempt. It seemed a more fitting use for it to provide shelter for those in genuine need, rather than to satisfy the greed of those who have enough. Susan Wilson began to cry quietly, a soft, whimpering sound. The dream that had been sold to her had vanished into thin air. Emily shot to her feet, her hands flat on the table. You can't do this. The inheritance, my inheritance. The foundation is your inheritance, Emily, I said. A legacy of generosity in your father's name. A legacy you are. Of course. Welcome to donate to... My words were met with a look of pure, undiluted hatred. But what about you? She demanded, her voice cracking. You still get to use it. The lawyer mentioned lifetime usage rights. Yes, I confirmed. The house will be there for me to use for the rest of my life, but it will never be yours. It will never be sold. It will never be collateral. Its value will be measured not in dollars, but in the good it does in your father's name. That is the one thing you can never touch. And then I looked directly at her, the daughter I had loved, the stranger who sat before me. Your father once told me that kindness without boundaries isn't a virtue. It's an invitation for disrespect. It took me a very long time to understand that he wasn't just talking about cousins or business partners. Sometimes, the people who need to see your boundaries the most are the ones standing closest to you. This is my boundary. Emily, it is made of steel. And it is permanent. It was over. Their faces showed the complete and utter devastation of their defeat. There were no more threats, no more arguments. There was nothing left to say. They filed out of the room, a broken, silent procession, leaving me in the quiet company of my lawyer and the enduring legacy of my husband. My final drive to Lake Chelan was a true pilgrimage. I drove alone, but I did not feel lonely. I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for 3 long years. When I arrived at the villa, it was silent, welcoming me home. I walked through the rooms, no longer seeing them as a stage for a battle, but as the archive of a life well lived. I ran my hand along the cool stone of the fireplace. I looked out the great window at the sunlight dancing on the lake. The house was the same, but I was different. The grief for Robert was still there, a gentle ache where a great love used to be. But it was no longer a weakness. It was a source of strength. I had protected what we built. I had honored his memory. On the terrace, I sat in my favorite chair, a cup of tea in my hand, and watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The house was quiet. My heart was quiet. I had rebuilt my own foundation, and it was unbreachable.